Have you done anything in your lab like a qualitative taxonomy of meaning? So imagine, because one of the things I've sort of thought through is, where do people derive proximal meaning? And so, and I kind of thought this through as a clinician. You should probably be about as educated as you are intelligent, or there's a lack. You need a career or a job, especially if you're conscientious. You need a vocation if you're creative. You need to spend your leisure time in some intelligent and productive and non-self-destructive manner. You need an intimate relationship. You need a family, etc. You can list maybe a dozen things that seem to be proximal sources of meaning, but I don't really have any idea how those rank order.
Yeah.
What is it that people require to make them feel both secure and exploratory? Is that a stable network of family and friends? Like, what's on top there? Do you have any sense of that?
So we have done studies where we've just asked people to tell us what makes your life meaningful. And it is qualitative. They just write. And then we use human coders, and we've also used coding software, scanning software. And not surprisingly, the most common response to that, the most frequent word uses in these narratives are about relationships, family and friends. And so it certainly seems to, and that's more than people write that more than they write about religion or anything else. We looked at this also among, to make sure there wasn't something dramatically different between believers and non-believers. We matched a sample and we recruited, because as you know, in the United States, even though a lot of people don't go to church, we're still talking about less than 10% or so of the population that will self-identify as totally atheist, right? Because people are, like you said, people are spiritual but not religious. So we specifically recruited a sample of people that said, they were the real deal, like hardcore atheists. And then we recruited a sample of believers, largely because we thought, well, that's one dimension that people might write about different things. And they didn't. Basically everyone said the same thing when what gives their life meaning, which was family and close relationships. And people did talk about it, so the coding picked up a few other things, like people talked some things about community. They talked about hobbies. They talked about careers, but but family was way up here, and those other things were down here.
So one thing would be very interesting then would be to see what sort of social networks the pessimists have.
Yeah.
Right. If you have a paucity of social networks, especially perhaps at the familial level, but maybe, friends and family are in some sense somewhat interchangeable. I doubt it, but perhaps they are. Maybe that's one of the things that sets you up really badly for optimism about the future.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point. And, one of the things that concerns me, of course, it's possible you could say, well, young people are, maybe more pessimistic, and they're college students, and there's something kind of edgy or, about being cynical, and, they're going to grow out of this, and, all that's certainly possible. But it seems to me like it's just would be way more beneficial for students to be able to say, hey, this is a real, again, using, the term privilege, this is a real privilege to be here. I'm taking a space that probably millions of people around the world would love to have this opportunity. And that comes with responsibility. But that doesn't seem to be that if you talk to people about responsibility, that gets you almost nowhere.
Well, that's funny though, because when I went on my tour for my book, I went to about 150 different cities. And one of the things that brought the audience, the only thing I would say that brought every audience I'd talked about it with to a complete silence, was the idea that meaning could be found in the adoption of responsibility. And so it was peculiar, because my original attitude would have been much like the one you just expressed, which is, well, good luck selling responsibility. That's what parents and figures of authority do all the time. But the thing is, they don't sell it as a source of meaning.
Right.
Yeah. They sell it as a moral obligation. And that's fine, because you can see the moral obligation element. But what they don't explain is that in undertaking that moral obligation, you find a sustaining meaning.
Right. No, I totally agree. I mean, one thing that, that I think that is interesting where I think a lot of people misunderstand meaning is they get that it's social. Well, it's like you can tell people find meaning in relationships, and that makes total sense to people. But in our society, people often think of relationships in a very, or I think about the meaning of relationships on a very superficial level. What I mean by that is people just like, well, you need people to like you and to support you. And you see this in the way we often approach things in academia, which is students want to feel supported. And so you see this very caregiving approach to social relationships, which I just want, we need to make sure there's no bullying, which, okay, we all agree on that. We need to make sure that people are nice to each other and that we have inclusive environments. And that's all great. But to me, that's not meaning. You need to so here's a good
Well, that
example.
might be the meaning of one kind of security that's rather maternal in its orientation, but it certainly doesn't exhaust the range of meanings that we might be encouraging university students to pursue.
Right. So here's an example. Imagine that you were, we'll use work just for, it'll be something people can understand. Imagine you were on a work team. A team got put together to work on a project. And everyone on that team was very nice to you and very kind to you. No one ever said a bad word to you. No one hurt your feelings. Everyone was very supported. But when it came time to get the work done, no one was interested in your contributions. In fact, they were like, oh, you don't need to worry about this, Jordan. We'll take care of it. Oh, that's fine. We all love you, Jordan. You're the... Okay, so think about that scenario and think about a different scenario in which, maybe there's more conflict. Or, maybe it's not high fives all the time or people aren't supporting you, but your contribution is valued. You're making a significant contribution to the team and you're needed.
That would be more akin to a sports team.
Right. But oftentimes I think in our society, the first approach is what people think of. And maybe, like you said, it's more of a maternal thing that it's like, well, we just need to support people. But the problem with that is, that's not a recipe to feel like you matter. In fact, people don't, over time, people figure out that, people are just pitying them and they don't really need them. They don't really like them, So, people need to have some skin in the game. They need to be making a contribution. This actually connects to the argument that I have against things like universal basic income, which we can or don't have to get into. But the idea is, it's great to think about taking care of people that, that we like that. Like, it feels good to be like, oh yeah, well, we want to help people. But oftentimes just taking care of people isn't allowing them to have agency. It's not allowing them to make a meaningful contribution. It's, in fact, it could, one of the predictors of the desire to die by suicide is feeling like a burden And so you can have the opposite effect where people feel like, well, the most meaningful thing I can do is to opt out because I'm not making a contribution. And so I'm very concerned about any kind of movement, even as kind-hearted as it seems, that's just about, well, let's just be nice to everyone and make sure everyone feels included and loved and supported. And that's all great. But to me, that's not meaning. We want to live in a polite society, of course. But people need to be able to make contributions, and people need to be able to feel that.
Well, you could even look at that from a Big Five perspective, Big Five personality perspective. I mean, that provision of basic care is an agreeable value, right? So it's a reflection of trait agreeableness. And well, on one end, trait disagreeableness is more associated with competition and conflict, right? And there's utility in that as well. So even by identifying taking care of people as the only value, we don't even exhaust the utility of trait agreeableness. Right. And then there's the meanings of duty and industriousness and orderliness that are associated with conscientiousness, and the meanings of creativity that are associated with openness. And you could maybe put security for neuroticism on the same axis as care, conceivably. But there's also meanings of extroversion, and none of those are addressed with a sole focus on providing security to people, let's say. I mean, I don't know if using the Big Five framework in that way is a good way of parsing up the universe of meaning, but, we do know those dimensions exist.
Yeah, no, yeah, that makes sense. So, so I think that when we talk about even social meaning, it has to go beyond just simple connectedness or having a lot of friends. I mean, this is why if you look at like the loneliness literature, this is what people can be surrounded by people who love them and still feel terribly lonely. Is it appears that a lot of these new age alternative beliefs are motivated by the need for meaning, but they don't seem to do a good job of providing meaning, because remember, they're inversely correlated with the presence of meaning. And I think for the reasons you just articulated, I mean, when we have a meaning framework of what some people might call a dogmatic framework, everything you just said, like, it organizes us. And not only that, but it gives us responsibilities and duties. So with this anything goes new age stuff, you can just say like, well, I'm not really into that, I'm into this. But if we have a shared religious belief that says, well, you have a duty to do this, like you have a duty to take care of your family, you have a duty to help your neighbor, it takes away the selfishness, right? It takes away well, I don't want to do that, I want to do this other thing. And that it might be that a lot of things that provide meaning are well, you talk about this in your latest book I just read, about responsibility, the connection of responsibility to meaning. Like these dogmas give you responsibilities, where I think about a lot of the new age stuff, it's like, you're not responsible for anything. No one's saying that, well, you have to do this or you have to do that. It's almost like it's a consumer experience of, well, this works for me or this doesn't work for me. And,
the problem is atomization, but also that lack of, and we should talk about meaning a little bit. I wrote a paper a long while back about different kinds of meaning, and they're sort of paradoxical, because there's the meaning that exists when something really unknown happens. And that's a funny meaning, because you don't know what it means, but it's meaningful, it's significant, and maybe you go out and explore it. But then there's the meanings associated with things that are fixed, right? That are already in place. And it seems like you need a balance between both of those to have an optimal experience of meaning, because one takes you way out on the fringes where, you're atomized and insane, and the other, locks you into a structure that has no escape and no room for you. So the meaning is this umbrella term, but decomposing it into its constituent elements also seems to be useful. And that would also allow for the investigation of what meaning suits what situation. Because sometimes what you want is the meaning of security, right? You want constraint. You want not that. I don't want all those choices. And other times that's not the case. Right.
Yeah, I think so. So I edited co-edited a book on the existential science of religion a couple of years ago. And one of the chapters that one of the contributions to the book was making this argument that religion functions as a meta choice, and it's for what you just said. So it actually promotes freedom, because people think of religion as being like restrictive, right? Often they're like, well, I can't do the things I want to do because religion's telling me I have to do. Here's all the things I have to do, right? Here's all the rules that are imposed upon me. But this argument was religion, at least done in a healthy way, as a meta choice, in the sense that there's this behavioral economics type of research where if you have too many choices, you're paralyzed by indecision. So if you narrow down, if you have too few, it's suffocating, right? So there's an optimal level of choice in which you're free, right? You're not overwhelmed, but you have options. And so what religion might do well is function as a meta choice, which is I can reduce to one choice the system. I can buy into the system that sets up these parameters and as a guidebook for how to live. So I don't have to think about every single little thing. Like I'm making the meta choice of buying into this framework. But that in itself is a choice, because you could say, well, I'm not going to do this anymore.
Yeah, well, you can think of it in that sense as something that's more akin to, and this isn't reductionistic, it's more akin to a game. mean, people aren't annoyed when they play Monopoly that they can't bounce a basketball off the center of the board, right? They're happy because they have adopted this set of rules that it enables a kind of cooperation and competition that's enjoyable and constrains choice to something approximating an optimal range.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, we could play Monopoly or we could play Catan, but fine, you make that decision. You got to play something, or you play by yourself in a corner. And that issue of being overwhelmed by choices, that's something that people don't seem to be quite as what would you say? They're not quite as aware of. If you tell people about that, they think, oh yeah, I know what you mean. But our society, and maybe that's because of its individualistic nature, is we recoil at constraint. We fail to see the fact that we do want our choices narrowed to a range of, I mean, look, what's our working memory capacity? 4 items, something like that, right? Our field of conscious choice is very narrow. And so when we're presented by options that exceed that constraint, and there's other constraints, it's very easy to become anxious instead of free.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so this is, I mean, and of course there are a number of people who have, put forward ideas like this, talking about the idea of ordered liberty or disciplined freedom, that you get more freedom when your life is disciplined. Like if you don't have certain rules that you live by, then your life can descend into chaos pretty quickly. I mean, people do this even when they think about something as simple as going on a diet, right? So if somebody gives you advice, like if you went to like a nutrition person, or you hired like a trainer or someone to help you lose weight or get healthy, one of the things they would tell you to do is if you don't have certain food in your house, you're less likely to at night be tempted to walk into the kitchen and eat a bunch of cookies if they're not there. But that requires a choice of not putting them there. So it's not a restriction on your freedom, right? You could get in your car, I guess, and drive out to the store and get cookies, but you're less likely to do it if you set up your environment in such a way that removes temptation. And so there's a lot of even very little things we do in life that are like that, right? Some people might say life hacks, right? Where we learn, well, if I do this, then I know myself, and I know I'm the type of person that after a long day's work, if I come home, I'm gonna drink too much beer, and so I'm just not gonna keep beer in the house. I'm gonna make beer a thing that I do only if I go out with friends. I mean, there are people that make these choices because they know they have vulnerabilities to, over drinking. And so I think there's lots of things in life that even beyond religion or, other systems in which, like you said, we kind of implicitly understand that you have to set up guardrails and rules, and people don't scream, well, that's anti-freedom. They think that's just being sensible and being reasonable. But when you talk about certain things like religious traditions or faiths, for some reason it seems to, at least in the kind of modern Western secular world, people seem to think that that's more oppressive.
Well, it's also
somehow.
I think partly because more academically oriented thinkers have proposed critiques of religion that are that reduce it to a single dimension and then criticize it along that dimension. And so the atheist types like Richard Dawkins, he tends to think that belief in God is like belief in a proposition, a stateable proposition. Is God real? Like, is a table real? And it isn't obvious that that's the proper way to formulate that issue. And you can make it absurd almost immediately by reducing it to that sort of representation. But there's multitude of functions that religious traditions serve. And even people like Becker, he basically reduced it to a single dimension. It's a defense against death anxiety. It's like, well, it may be that, but it certainly isn't only that. It's a very, very complex issue.
Right.
And so, but people run into these critiques. Marxist critique, religion is the opiate of the masses. Or the Freudian critique, which is, well, God is essentially a projection of the father, an infantile projection of the father. It's like, well, yes, sometimes in some cases and in some ways, but wait. I guess it depends too to some degree, and maybe you could tell me what you think about this. It seems to me that the core of a culture is something that's essentially religious. By definition, like if you look at what unites people across geography and time, there's some central conception of the world as spirit that brings people together implicitly and explicitly. And then if you dispense with that, well, then what? Well, you've demonstrated that, you get people adopting rather odd beliefs. So that's a kind of heresy, essentially. So there's an automatic tendency to produce heretical religions. That's the consequence. And maybe some of those are political, and they're fragmentary.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's actually why I started looking at the individual difference level of analysis, not because I was particularly interested in thinking about spirituality or religion or any of these things as an individual difference. What I was interested in is if there is, people did this when they talked about the need to belong. You can pretty much get everyone to agree that humans are social and have a fundamental need to belong. That's not controversial. So you can use that as an example. And what researchers did, they said, if that's true, then you would expect there to be natural variability. Everyone might have some basic need to belong, but there are going to be some people that are very, very oriented towards belongingness, whereas others aren't going to be so much. And so that individual difference isn't a case against the basic need. It's saying that the basic need manifests, differently across the continuum. And so that's pretty much my argument, I think, for religion and spirituality is that what you just said, I think is true. If a society abandons religion, they don't really become secular. They start investing in all sorts of other things, what we might call like a substitution hypothesis to fill that space of the role that, or the multiple roles that religion was playing in their society. But then an important question, which we talked about a little bit, is just because people are turning to different things to fulfill that function doesn't mean they're actually doing a good job of fulfilling it, right? Just because people are turning to politics as a substitute religion or UFOs or New Age beliefs doesn't mean those things are actually doing a good job of providing meaning. Depending on who's talking and on what day, it varies from we've only got like a decade left before the planet turns into an uninhabitable hellscape to, on the more optimistic side, you'll see some people say, well, we can still do something to mitigate it. But you do see, again, there are plenty of environmental activists that I think are very practical, very solution oriented, very entrepreneurial, who are thinking about technologies and strategies to make.
Lomberg is like that.
Right. But then there is an element of these activists that it is almost like an apocalyptic meaning making religion, where, because the reason I say that is because it seems to accompany this antinatalist and
right
view of, it's almost as if the best. So how you might ask, well, what's that got to do with meaning? Well, it's almost as if what they're arguing is the most meaningful thing that humans can do is go away. Right? Like,
yes. Well, you see
surrender the planet to the other species because we've screwed it up.
So we started this discussion talking about Ernest Becker and a rather unidimensional view of meaning, but your walk through your research and this discussion indicates that you've, as a consequence of studying this for so long, you've developed a much more multidimensional sense of meaning. Yeah, that's absolutely not reductionistic in the same way, that's not merely defensive, that can't be reduced to the terror of death or defenses against that. And so, is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we close?
No, I think we covered a lot of the areas that I'm interested in. I mean, one thing I'll just, I can just add that, because you're absolutely right. Like what I've tried to do, and this is part of what I like about being a researcher, is I've tried to just kind of follow the data. Like I have ideas, of course, I have my own biases, and but I've tried, like with the nostalgia work I talked about, I try really hard to test hypotheses, but then look, kind of see what's going on. And then that gives me ideas, or make observations in the real world. And that gives me ideas. And so you're right. I have gone kind of on this journey where I definitely started out in this more kind of defensive approach, because that's what I learned in graduate school, and have moved more towards this explorative, growth oriented kind of creative approach to meaning. And I do think they are connected through, some of the attachment and social and cultural security systems and frameworks we talked about. But now, so I'm even going further in the direction of looking at like how meaning contributes to things like entrepreneurship. Because as you noted before, there's a certain level, even if you look at the developmental literature on attachment, like you talked about the studies where the little kids, when they venture away from mom's the security that gives them, that makes them feel like there's something there that will protect them, which makes them a little bit more willing to explore. Well, if you scale that out on a society level, and we look at topics like entrepreneurship, which involves risk taking and putting yourself out there, and oftentimes failing repeatedly, is that, can you imagine that same kind of framework where a society that has existential frameworks, whether they be strong social relationships, religion, other cultural worldviews, that provide the type of security that encourages people to innovate and to take risks. And so that's kind of the direction I've been going in more recently, which I think very much connects to this overall project that we've been talking about, because we need that, right? We need risk takers. We need people who are optimists, who can look at the same set as data of everyone else, and everyone else feels pessimistic, to be like, no, I think there's a solution. We just haven't figured this out yet. And I think those people are often inspired by meaning, right? Meaning isn't, in my world, another way to say this, meaning isn't an outcome variable. It's a predictor variable, right? It's, because we tend to think of meaning as an indicator of well-being, which it is. But in addition to that, I would say it's a cause. In fitness research, they've done some studies showing that when people think about what's important, what's meaningful in their life, they're more likely to exercise. When you feel like your life's meaningful, you've got like a reason to get up every day and do something. And sometimes that something is take risks, to try new things, because you want to make the world better. You want to make life better for your family. And so I think that we just have to be really careful about that. Like that's an important element of life. And if you have too much cynicism and nihilism and pessimism and antinatalism, and people don't feel like they've got something to strive for into the future, then not only are we going to see psychological and social decline, but we'll see economic decline as well. And we won't be able to solve the problems that people say they're really concerned about, such as climate change, if you don't have people that believe in the future is worth saving to begin with.
So just for the benefit of the audience, the biggest difference known between men and women in terms of individual differences is interest in people versus interest in things. And men are more interested in things and women more interested in people. On average, the difference is about 1 standard deviation, which is very large by the standards of such things. And so you could imagine that maybe it's more acceptable, more understandable for people who are primarily interested in things to view the world mechanistically. Whereas, so that's a metaphor, the world is a machine. And there's a kind of determinism that goes along with that, but also a logical analyzability and a reductionism and a decomposition that would all go along with tool formation, let's say. Whereas you could also visualize being as a spirit. And that also makes sense because the community in some sense is a spirit, and other people are spirits. And animals are spirits. They're personality-like. And so to view existence itself as characterized by personality would be a different approach, but one that would have its benefits and detractions, just as viewing it like a machine might.
Right.
I'm often struck by the fact that, it seems to me that engineer types are more likely to be critical of mythology and narrative, religious in nature, particularly because it doesn't align with their mode of thinking, but they tend to pick up their mythology in the form of, say, science fiction. It comes in a more implicit level.
Right. You're actually getting to to a series of studies that we did looking at this. So there were some surveys that came out a number of years ago that found that the more secular people were, the more likely they were to believe in UFOs. And when I say
that's
UFO,
perfect. That goes along with Jung's analysis of visions of UFOs in the sky, right? He thought those were replacements for religious revelations, the angels essentially descending from on high.
Yeah, exactly. Michael Shermer and I talked about this because he's written about this before. That he's got a great quote that UFOs are like deities for atheists, or I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something to that effect. But there's these surveys that find that the more secular people are, the more likely they are to believe in UFOs. And not just UFOs in the sense that, well, we don't know what these things are, but they're likely to believe that there's intelligent alien life among us. So they're really taking a leap of faith. So that those surveys existed, but what we were interested in our lab was, well, to what if religion is about meaning, which there's a lot of studies looking at the existential benefits of religion, including meaning making. We're like, well, if a religion's about meaning, and people who aren't religious might be more vulnerable to not having meaning, and thus more likely to be searching for meaning, would they be more likely? Would that explain why they're more likely to believe in UFOs? So, in other words, from like a methodological point of view, what we did is we looked at this correlation between lack of belief in religion and a positive belief in aliens to see if it was mediated, see if that relationship is mediated by these meaning making variables. And so there's these measures that maybe you're familiar with called the presence of meaning, which measures to what extent you actually see your life as meaningful. And then there's another measure called the search for meaning, which is basically to what extent you're currently looking for meaning in life. They tend to be negatively correlated, not always, but it makes sense that they are, because the more you feel like your life is full of meaning, the less in need you are to go look for new meaning. And so what we found was we found a support for a mediation model in which the less people believed in God, the less meaning they reported having, the higher they were in search for meaning, which in turn predicted their belief in aliens and UFOs.
So have you expanded that to political belief? Because one of the things I heard this survey once from the Gallup organization in Canada. Now, you may know this, you may not, but Canada has had its bouts of separatism, right? Quebec, our French-speaking province, has put forward the plans to separate a number of times and has come very, very close to breaking up the country. And Quebec was the last country in the West, really, to radically abandon Catholicism. It was a really Catholic country till like 1959, and then it just disappeared. And now Quebec has like the lowest birth rate in the Western world, or close to, and very many out of wedlock common law households rather than formally married. And whereas in the 50s, the typical family had 12 children, it's like one now. So radical transformation in a very short period of time that dovetailed with this rise in Quebec nationalism. And I always thought, well, Catholicism disappeared and the state became the religion. And then I saw a Gallup poll that indicated that if you were a lapsed Catholic, you were 10 times more likely to be a separatist. I thought, well, there's evidence that when the religious instinct falls out of the religious domain, it plummets down to something like the political level, and then the political becomes religious. And so you're seeing that people who are less formally religious, and do you distinguish between dogmatic belief and spiritual belief? Because that's often distinguished. But in any case, they're more likely to believe in these extraterrestrial events. Any work at all on the political end?
So I haven't done any empirical work on the political end, but what you just said is exactly what I was thinking. Now, there is some work in this model of compensatory control. So they're not looking at meaning; they're looking at a sense of control in life, and they found like the there's a paper on it, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's called something like God or Government. And basically what they find is the less religious a society is, the more people want big government. And so the idea is that people want some kind of controlling structure that helps make, when you feel personally out of control, that helps order the world. And if a society moves away from religion, they tend to be more interested in government, which isn't exactly what you were saying, but I think
it's close though. It's close, and I mean it indicates, like your research seems to indicate, is that there is this fundamental impulse towards something approximating religious belief. And so then you might think, well, in most cultures, particularly traditional cultures, that need is fulfilled by the totality of the culture. It's relatively integrated and everything is oriented in the same direction. Whereas in our culture that's fragmented to the degree that it has, that's all gone away. But that doesn't mean that the desire for something like coherence has, and I can't see how it can disappear, because who wants incoherence? I mean, that's uncertainty and trouble. And maybe that's driving part of this search for meaning that you're describing.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the things that's really fascinating about this, because when I was doing this work and I was writing a book on all of this, so I was doing empirical work, but I was also looking at broad trends. So if you look in the US at the areas of the country that are the least religious, so you can look at that both in terms of self-identified religiosity, but you can also look at church attendance and other indicators of religion. Those are the places where the New Age industry is thriving, right? So like on the coast, right? So you can, at that broad level of analysis, you can say the more secular parts of society tend to be the ones that go more in on New Agey stuff. They also tend to be the one, and this gets to what you're saying, that also tends to connect with the political activism. And I remember this happening during maybe it's the early Trump administration years, that you'd see these articles in places like the New York Times. Like, these weren't fringe outlets. You'd see articles where it's talking about like witchcraft, the resistance witchcraft. So there were witches that were trying to cast spells against Republicans and Donald Trump, and there were these articles, totally unironic, and it wasn't like they were presenting this and saying like, wow, these people really believe this stuff. They were just presenting it as, this is how it is, right? There's these people, and this is what. So
imagine this is something I've read, that as it's analogous to what you're saying, that as belief in the dogmatic traditions of religion decline, there's a corresponding increase in the number of people who claim to be spiritual. So there's a separation between spiritual and dogmatic. And so it's really easy to criticize dogma. You say, well, do you really believe that concrete thing? Why not make it more abstract? Well, it's less susceptible to rational criticism. And so that's advantageous. It's more individually tailored in some sense. But the problem is it lacks structure and the ability to unite people. And obviously the problem with New Age spirituality in some sense is that everything goes. And there's no uniting. See, the thing about dogma, because it's codified and traditional, everyone shares it. And then you can think about it in terms of your own speaking, your own thinking as well. Like, you and I can have this conversation because we accept a whole variety of things dogmatically. We can experiment on the fringes a bit. We don't have to dig into what each of us means by every single term. So we stand on dogma and make a foray out into investigation. But when you get rid of the dogma, well, you get rid of the blinders and the constraints, but you seem to also get rid of the structure and the coherence and the thing that organizes the community. And it certainly doesn't appear to me that New Age thinking is more coherent than, say, Catholic thinking. Not at all.
Right. Well, so you're actually getting into exactly what we observed.
One of the things I learned really a lot from reading Russian neuropsychology, strangely enough, the Russians had great neuropsychologists, was that the sense of meaning, the sense of engagement that characterizes life when life is progressing in the manner that you would like it to progress is actually an instinct. It's not a cognitive phenomenon. It's not a second-order consequence of thought. It's way deeper than that. It's an extraordinarily profound instinct. And so that's really worth thinking about, assuming, as you might, that we're adapted creatures and that our instincts guide us in the world so that we can survive and so that we can reproduce and so that we can exist over long periods of time. The fact that an instinct of that depth exists and that it's associated with the sense of vital engagement in being, let's say, is a good indication, as good an indication as there is, that there's something truly real about it. And I would say that might even be more important than the knowledge of the role that the serotonin system plays in adjudicating hierarchical position. Because we tend to think of meaning as something that people create as a secondary consequence through thinking or through philosophy or something like that. And when we think that, it's easy to criticize it. It's easy to become cynical about it. It's easy to lose faith in it. But when you understand that it actually is a much deeper phenomenon than that, and that the cognitive elements, the philosophical elements, are sort of like, well, they're like the fronds on the top of the pond on a plant system that has unbelievably deep roots that go way down into the water. There's something about that that's much firmer and more solid. And I think the evidence that meaning is an instinct, a deep, deep instinct, is overwhelming. I don't think that popular knowledge has caught up with that. I mean, the research it's not new, but it's been done, I would say, in the main in the last 30 years or so, and mostly by psychobiologists, like people who are really on the hard science end of psychology. And their work is difficult. It's technically difficult. It involves a lot of neurobiology, neuroanatomy, psychopharmacology. It's hard work. It's hard going, but it's unbelievably useful. I have 2 books in my reading list, by the way, at jordanpeterson.com. If you're interested in this sort of thing, one is by a man named Jaak Panksepp, who's an absolute genius. He died a few years ago, unfortunately. I think he deserved a Nobel Prize, and you never know, maybe he'll still get one, because he discovered whole circuits, mammalian circuits, that no one knew existed. So, for example, Panksepp outlined a play circuit in mammals. There's a separate biological play circuit in mammals. And it's a big deal to discover an entire new neurological continent, right? That's a big discovery. And that wasn't all he did. It was one of many things he did. So the book is called Affective Neuroscience, which is a rather intimidating title. It means emotional neuroscience. And you wouldn't think you'd necessarily pick up a book on neuroscience for a light read, but it's actually a very readable book. It's the people who work on emotions in neuroscience tend to be a little bit more romantic for scientists, and they're a little more interested in story and narrative. And so he tells a whole sequence of stories in affective neuroscience, and it's a very readable book, and it's a great book. If you're interested in psychology, I would highly recommend it. And then there's another book there called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which was written by a man named Jeffrey Gray. And that damn thing's, that's hard. That's like a 6-month slog, that book. I mean, he had an absolutely encyclopedic knowledge of animal behavior and neurobiology and psychopharmacology. And I don't know how many references there are in that book, 2,400, something like that. And he read them. He didn't just cite them. And not only did he read them, he also understood them and integrated them. And so it's a tough read, but man, I tell you, there's really something to that. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, although not all of it, is derived from those books. And so I would recommend them if you'd like to go more deeply into these sorts of topics. And so that's Rule 7. Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient, because meaning is an instinct. And meaning is the instinct that guides you in life across the totality of life, right? What's expedient, that's what you might want to do right now in an impulsive sense, right? Because you're driven forward by, anger or anxiety or frustration or disappointment or despair, some sort of one-eyed motivational monster that's got you in its grip that really isn't considering everything at once, right? Like considering your life tomorrow or your life next week or your family's life or maybe even your well-being half an hour from now, because you lash out in anger, and you can, people do that. It's understandable. Sometimes it's even necessary, but it's not wise generally. And the instinct for meaning seems to be a consequence of the integration of all of those underlying motivations and emotions with social being, and then the manifestation of something like the proper pathway forward. And so And you need that because you need to know how to move forward in life, because you need to move forward in life. You need to act in life. And the other thing that's, I suppose, part and parcel of, let's say, 12 rules for life is the insistence upon action as of primary import. We're not fundamentally creatures who passively perceive the objective world. That's not the goal of our perceptual systems. It's not the goal of our memory. The reason that you have memories isn't to remember the past. The reason you have memories is so that if something bad happened to you in the past, you can figure out what it was that was bad, and you can figure out why it happened, and then you can not do it again in the future, right? It's very practical. And it's the same on the positive end of the spectrum. If good things happen to you in the past, then conceivably duplicating whatever you did to get those good things to happen could have them happen again in the future. So it's practical memory, and it's oriented towards action, and it's oriented towards like the quality of your life, not to the description of the objective world, even though that may be a useful thing to do, at least under some circumstances. Sure.
Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient.
Right, that's rule 7 in the book. So here's a strange idea, but this is another example of, I think, where the physical and the metaphysical touch. So we talked about what reality might look like. There's a material reality, let's say, that's what is, but then there's the reality of what could be, that's potential, it's something like that. And so potential has this weird existence. Well, here's another strange thing. You might say, well, what's the best way of conceptualizing reality at the highest level of abstraction? What is reality? There's this old Taoist symbol, the yin and yang symbol, eh? So there's a black serpent, and it has a white dot in it, and there's a white serpent, and it has a black dot in it, and they're tail to tail. And that whole symbol is Tao. And Tao means a bunch of things. It means potential. It means the way of life. So to live in Tao is to live in the proper manner. And you kind of live on the border between the black serpent and the white serpent. And then you say, well, what are those two things? Well, they're the two ultimate categories of reality, yin and yang. Well, how would you translate that into English? Well, masculine, feminine, that's one translation. But a better one, I would say, is order and chaos. You say, well, what's order and what's chaos? Well, order is when you're where what you're doing is producing what you want to have happen. Okay, so why is that orderly? It's because you can predict it. You do A, and you want B to happen, and B happens. So what does that mean? It means you know where you are, you know what you're doing, and things are working. And then you're calm, because there's nothing to be nervous about, and you're moderately happy, because you're getting what you need and want. And there's evidence that you are competent, because that's why things are working. That's order. Now, everyone knows that order can be shattered into disorder at the drop of a hat. You can be walking down the street and you're all happy and you're with your partner and, you know, she makes a mistake and steps off the curb and a bus hits her. It's like in 1 second you are not anymore in order. Like the bottom has fallen out of your life. And that's why there's a black dot in the white serpent. It's like, orderly as it is, look the hell out, because your life can be flipped upside down in a moment.
Right.
Okay. Well, then sometimes you're in a dire state and everything looks absolutely hopeless, and you get a new realization and bang, you know, everything snaps together. And so that's when you're in chaos and order can reveal itself. Okay, so order and chaos. You can think about it as the ice that you skate on with the water below. That's another way of thinking about it. Now you say, well, is that real? Is it really that the world is made out of order and chaos? Well, here's something weird. You have two hemispheres. Right? And hypothetically, they were selected by the processes of natural evolution, right? They were selected by reality. Well, you have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. So it's kind of like, well, reality must have two elements, because why would you need two hemispheres otherwise? And they do have relatively separate consciousnesses, those two hemispheres. You think, well, okay, we've been selected to have this bifurcated view of reality. Well, what are they specialized for? Turns out the left hemisphere is specialized for those places where your routines work. That's the left hemisphere. And the right hemisphere is specialized for all those places you go when you don't know what you're doing. So the left hemisphere is specialized for order, and the right hemisphere is specialized for chaos. And so then you might think, well, does that mean that the world being is really made out of order and chaos. It's like, well, if you use the Darwinian logic, that's what it means. Okay, so what does meaning signify? Well, here's what it is, as far as I can tell. So imagine that you're watching a gymnast, and two gymnasts. We'll start with the first one. And the gymnast pops out on the floor and does her routine, and she's like, she's on it, man. Like, you can tell this girl has put her 50,000 hours in, and every single thing, impossible thing she does in succession is flawless, right? And at the end, she, what would you say?
Voila.
Displays herself to the crowd, right? And the crowd is like, wow, that's so impressive, because they think, wow, she's human, and look what humans can do, and isn't that so cool? And they're so thrilled, and the judges go 9.8, 9.8, 9.8. It's like, because I think it's 10 points for gymnasts, and it's like, well, now what does the next gymnast do? Because how do you top perfection, right? Because you can't. But that's not true. You can. So the next gymnast comes out, and she goes through her routine too, and it's perfect, but it's more than perfect, because you can see that with every bloody move she makes, she's pushing herself right to the ragged edge of disaster. Like, she's risking the performance of her life, and that means she's risking a big mistake, because you risk that when you do the performance of your life, and you can just see her straining. It's like when you hear a great violinist or a great guitarist play something, and they bend and twist all the notes, so they're kind of rough and ragged, and they know how to do it perfectly, and they put this vicious edge on it. It's like, you just love that. And so the gymnast is out there just stretching herself right to the limit of her ability, right? And then she does voila, right? And she's sweating, and it's like triumph, and the whole damn crowd just leaps to their feet, because she was better than perfect. She was perfect in the way that will make her more perfect in the future. And that's meaningful. And that's why the crowd leaps to its feet. And she's on that border between chaos and order. And that's meaningful. And so what I would say is, what your brain does for you is tell you when you're in the right place at the right time by infusing your life with significance and engagement. And it's saying, look, you've got the cosmos is lined up around you. It really, truly is. You're right in the right place at the right time. You're in your domain of competence, but you're stretching yourself so that you're actually improving at the same time. And that's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. And so I think for a long time we've cast doubt on the reality of meaning. That's part of the death of God. There's no real meaning in life. It's like, no. It does not look like that's true. It looks like it might be the case that there's nothing more real in life than the sense of meaning. I actually think you can I do make that case in 12 Rules for Life. I think you can make a completely coherent case that meaning is an unerring guide. There's limits. If you're going to allow your sense of meaning to guide you, you don't want to lie to yourself, because you pathologize the instinct. Because if you keep filling your head up with nonsense, the meaning generator is going to become corrupted, and it's going to make things shine for you that shouldn't shine. They'd only shine for someone who's corrupt. So if you're going to be guided by your sense of meaning, then don't fill your spirit with garbage. And that sort of applies to the first few rules. Don't lie. Don't do things that you hate.
You're building upon the previous rules.
Right. Don't make the thing that guides you ill.
And so you think that meaning is that living on the border of chaos and order.
You bet.
That's
the Tao.
Really,
That's the Tao.
yeah.
That's where you are. If you live in Tao, it's on the line between chaos and order.
Controversy, or on the other end, you say not what is expedient. So how do you confuse those two things? What do those two things look like?
Okay,
how do you not confuse them?
No problem. Look, so I came in here for this discussion today, and I could be thinking, I want to tailor this interview so that I sell as many books as possible. So I have a goal. I'm going to come in here, and if you veer off on some topic that I don't think is relevant to my goal of selling books, then I'm not going to participate. I'm going to steer you back. I'm going to mention it every chance that I get, because what I want to have happen from this talk is that I make more money. It's like, okay, so then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to manipulate the conversation to facilitate that goal. Okay, so that's expedient. But then I could say, no, let's not bother with that. Not because there's anything wrong with that. I mean, it's not a problem to have a goal. It's a problem to manipulate people.
Sure.
But I knew we were going to talk about the book, so it wouldn't be like out of you wouldn't regard that as incomprehensible if it started to happen. If I said something, well, can we direct the conversation back to the book? You wouldn't take offense to that, not in any real sense. But what I would do, and what I want to do instead is come and, you guys like to have open discussions. And like what we're doing when we're having an open discussion is we're trying to elevate each other's spirits. And so that's like rule 9, right? Assume that the person you're listening to knows something you don't. It's like there's things you need to know. There's things I need to know. There's things you need to know. If we actually have a talk, maybe we'll all come away less stupid. And since if you're stupid, you wander into a pit, then maybe it would be better if you weren't stupid. And so I'd rather come on and say, well, let's engage. So let's occupy that place of meaningful conversation. Let's trust it and see where it goes. And then let's assume that whatever happens is the best thing that could have happened. It doesn't matter. Because maybe the right outcome for this podcast isn't a particular percentage of increment in book sales. Maybe it's the fact that, well, we got along and we decided to do something else together in the future, or maybe 5 things in the future, or maybe it's more inspiring for the listeners. And so there's also this idea. This relates to the idea about truth. There's a real fundamental idea that's really deeply rooted in Western civilization, which is that the most daring possible approach to life, and I would say the most meaningful approach, is to tell the truth and let whatever happens happen. It's an adventure. It's like, so I could come in here and say, well, I'm going to craft this conversation so it's about my book. And it's kind of predictable. I know what's going to happen. But it's way more engaging to say, no, let's just have the best conversation we can have and then wait and see what happens. Well, that's way more, that's super interesting. That's way more interesting. It's way more meaningful.
Almost, in other words, like short-sighted, expedient.
That's right. That's the problem. I don't think there's anything that has longer vision than that sense of meaning. Okay, so I'll tell you something that's so cool. This just bloody well blew me away when I learned it. This is from Jung as well. So we talked about the idea of the self, right? So the self is everything you are and everything you could be across time. Okay, but here you are caught in this little fragment of time. But there's this you that has the potential across time. Well, and it's something that you're trying to grow towards to maximize your potential, right? So then you might ask, well, how does that potential manifest itself in the present so that it can be revealed? Well, the answer is through the instinct of meaning. So that was Jung's answer. I thought, wow, that's just mind-boggling, that idea. It's like, okay, you could be more than you are, obviously. That's obviously the case. How does that manifest itself in the moment? Well, that which you could be tells you where to walk by making that path meaningful. Wow. It's like, really? Could that be the case? Well, what else would make what you're doing meaningful? It's like, come up with a different explanation if you want. See if you can come up with a better explanation, because I don't think you can.
Walking the path that's more challenging.
Yeah, because you need to be optimally challenged, right? Because you're not. So here's a couple of things that we've learned recently. So I could say, well, why do we grow in a conversation that's genuine? Well, it's because we're sharing information, right? And then we build each other out of the information. We build ourselves out of the information. So that's just a cognitive approach. But here's something else that we've learned recently. Is like, let's say you go pick up a new, like a physical hobby. Like you start weightlifting, or maybe you do jujitsu or something like that. And so you're in a new environment and you're faced with new challenges. Genes in your brain turn on that weren't on before. And they code new proteins and they build new structures. And so inside the genetic structures that underlie your physiology are all sorts of physiological potentials that won't manifest themselves unless you put yourself in a new situation. And so by challenging yourself constantly, you're turning on parts of yourself that wouldn't otherwise be on. You could say, well, life is horrible and tragic and bitter and cruel, and everyone is suffering from being persecuted and from evil. It's like, yeah, okay, it's fine. So how are you going to deal with that? Turn yourself on. You go everywhere and click everything on, and then maybe maybe you could handle it. So I'll tell you a wonderful story. So in the Chartres Cathedral, the cathedral is a cross. Okay, so the cross, The center of the cross is the center of consciousness. It's the point of maximal suffering. Okay, the cathedral's a cross. Now, on the floor of the cathedral is a maze, a big maze, and you can walk it. So you go into the maze at the bottom quadrant, and then you walk all the way through the bottom right-hand quadrant, completely walk through it, and then you get to the top right-hand quadrant, and you walk all the way through that. Then you get to the top left one, and you walk all the way through that, and the bottom left one, and then you come to the center. It's a symbolic pilgrimage. So what it means, and it's a map of the world, north, south, east, and west. So it's symbolically the world. So the idea is that you have to walk through the entire world in order to get to the center. So you have to go everywhere and do everything to turn yourself on enough so that you can handle what's coming towards you. And you do that voluntarily. You open yourself up to the challenge. It's like, wow, I read all that. I thought, wow, that's such an amazing idea. It's so, and it's true because, all you do if you shrink from life,
Right.
the more you shrink, the smaller you get, unsurprisingly, right?
Sure, yeah.
And the more you move forward confidently and willing to take on the challenge and the potential danger, then the stronger you get. And then you might say, well, what's the upper limit to that strength? Well, you're really good for you. That would be good. You're really good for you and your family at the same time. It's like, oh, bargain. You're really good for your family and your community at the same time. And then you're really good for all of those in a way that gets better and better across time. It's like, well, that would be the ultimate expression of human possibility. It's like, well, that's a hell of an antidote to chaos.